Hey guys, my name's Aton and I'm here to talk about Harmonia, a project me and Winston have been working on for the Ethereum Global Hackathon. Um, this project was inspired by our experiences with like renting properties. So being a renter, um, it feels like a lot of the times you are kind of at the mercy of the landlord in a lot of different respects. So if I, decide to go rent an apartment today, um, the landlord will come back to me if I'm approved and offer me a lease. And, the lease usually lasts for like 12 months and they ask for some form of, deposit. Let's say in this example, it's $5,000. So I have to put up that deposit of $5,000. The landlord has custody over that deposit. And at the end of the 12-month lease, the landlord has a lot of, power in terms of what they can do with my deposit. They could say, hey, I feel like you've damaged my property. I'm going to take all of your deposit. And my only recourse as a renter is to take the landlord to small claims. Um, I really don't have any other options. And, taking someone to small claims can be very time consuming, could possibly be expensive if lawyers are involved, and is just kind of a headache. So our solution is Harmonia, which has a couple different aspects to it. We have our own native token, the Harmonia token, and people can purchase the token. They can stake it, and I'll talk about staking a little bit later. And then we have our arbitrator contract, and what that contract does, that smart contract does, is it handles first the agreement itself. And so we've made this arbitrator contract super generic. It doesn't have to be, specifically for renting properties. It could really be used for any type of agreements where you have to put up some collateral. Um, so yeah, it should be pretty flexible. But I think using the landlord renter example kind of helps visualize how this thing might work in the real world. To start with, the offerer submits an agreement to the offeree. Now, what does that mean? The offer in this case would be the landlord, and the offeree could be you know, the renter, the person who wants to rent the apartment. So the offer sets the terms of the lease in this example. You know, Lease expires in 12 months and requests, let's say, $5,000 as a deposit. The offeree or the renter can either accept the terms of the agreement or decline. Obviously, if they decline, nothing happens. If they accept, they have to put up um, the amount the offerer is requesting as collateral. And so they deposit. Let's say the offer requests $5,000. They'll deposit $5,000 into the smart contract. Um, Ideally, the deposit would be in some type of stable coin. Right now, we're just using ETH just because it's easier. But eventually, we would like to use some form of stable coin as deposits to ensure that market volatility doesn't negatively impact someone. So, anyways, back to the agreement. So, let's say the renter approves the agreement. Now, at the end of the lease, at the end of the agreement, before the agreement expires, um, let's say the landlord, feels that their property was damaged in some way, and they want some compensation pulled out from the deposit. Now, the landlord in this case can't just pull that deposit out of the smart contract. They don't have that type of power, um, which is good because it protects the renter. But what they can do is open a dispute. And so when they open a dispute, that dispute is attached to the original agreement, and they can, claim like, oh, I want $2,000 in damages. They can provide some evidence, so photos, files, whatever. That's all stored on IPFS. And then they open a dispute. Uh, the renter can then either accept the terms of the dispute, pay what they think that they owe, and then the whatever amount that they agree to pay is then transferred to the landlord, who can then pull the money out whenever they want from the smart contract. However, if they decline the terms of the dispute, now the dispute is open to vote. So who are the voters? The voters are community members that have the Harmonia token staked um, in the protocol. So they have to have at least one Harmonia token staked in the protocol in this example. Obviously, in a real live example, that might need to be changed. We might need them to stake more. Um, but the staking is done so that they become responsible members of the community. So if they, um, to make sure that if they are, participating in some unfair fashion, that we can penalize them in some form. Um, Also, we want to, provide them financial incentives for participating, effectively in this protocol. So, people who have their tokens staked, they have the power to vote on different disputes, and they can look at, all the evidence and decide whether, in this case, the landlord is correct and should receive some form of compensation, or maybe, the landlord is being unfair and um, either should receive less in terms of compensation, or maybe is just making things up and shouldn't receive any compensation. Anyways, the vote is open to anyone staking the Harmonia token, and if they participate in the voting process, they receive rewards in the form of Harmonia tokens. And so that's kind of a way to financially incentivize people to vote. Um, in the future, we would also like to look at ways to penalize voters that are voting unfairly or in a way incorrectly. So, as an example, let's say 90% of voters vote that the landlord, should receive compensation, and 10% of voters feel like, the landlord shouldn't. Well, in that situation, if 90% of people, side with the landlord, it seems like the 10% that didn't might either not be paying attention, not voting, correctly, or just not good voters in general. And so we would want to penalize that people either by withholding their rewards or maybe, taking some of their stake away. Right now, we don't have that implemented. These are just kind of ideas that we've been talking about in order to kind of socially engineer a situation where everyone's like kind of a good actor in this protocol. Anyway, so voters vote, and at the end of the voting deadline, if the majority of voters vote for, in our situation, the landlord, agreeing that he should receive compensation, well, then however much the compensation they requested is then transferred to the landlord, who can then pull it out of the smart contract. And if for some reason the voters feel like the landlord is incorrect and don't agree with their dispute, then the offeree, or the renter in this case, keeps their money, and that's that. Um, there's also an appeal process that we've been kind of thinking through, but that's kind of how it works in a nutshell. So I'm gonna pull up the code real quick, and so we deployed our smart contract on Scale, which is a gasless sidechain. And the reason we wanted to deploy on a sidechain, like a L2 solution, is because of gas fees. Like today, I was doing some stuff on the Ethereum mainnet, and sorry about that. I was trying to do some things on the Ethereum mainnet, and man, gas fees were like $200 for. I think I was just trying to bridge some of my Matic tokens from the Ethereum mainnet to the Matic sidechain, and that literally they wanted to charge me $200, which is kind of insane. And in this whole voting process, we need people to be able to vote and participate and stake and make sure that they're financially incentivized to do it. So if there's high gas fees, there is absolutely no financial incentive to participate. So we need to make sure that things are gasless. So we deployed on Scale. We're using IPFS for the agreements and the disputes. So in the agreement, there might be some documents that the offer needs to include in the agreement, or the offeree needs to include, and so we store those on IPFS. And for the disputes as well, there's some evidence that maybe the offerer or the offeree want to include in their dispute, and so we store all of that on IPFS. We also talked about um, encryption. So, in the voting process, we want to make sure that votes are done in a kind of a fair process. So, for example, if everyone sees people voting a certain way, they might just vote that certain way, even though they didn't look at the evidence. And we want to prevent that from happening. They might just be clicking, vote yes or vote no, because they see everyone else doing it and they just want rewards. So we want to prevent that. And the way we want to prevent it is through some form of encryption. We want to encrypt the vote results until the voting deadline has passed. And we talked about a lot of different ways to do it. Unfortunately, we weren't able to implement it in time for the hackathon deadline. But one simple way that we talked about was, you know, uh, we have a private key that the offerer creates when he opens a dispute, and then that's stored in NuCipher. So only the offerer has access to the private key, and then the public key is stored on chain, and voters can then use the public key to hash their votes. And then at the end of the voting deadline, both the offerer and the offerer first releases the private key on chain. So now everyone has access to decrypt the results, and then the offerer, the offeree, and maybe the voters decrypt the results. And if all the results matches, then we know, okay, that was decrypted correctly, and then we can restore the votes on chain and then resolve the dispute. So I'm going to go through just some of our unit tests because I think it will give a good um, kind of primer to how things work. So just running our unit test real quick, but the way it works is first an agreement is opened. Then, in this case, the agreement is opened from the landlord to the tenant. And then the tenant can respond to the agreement. And if they respond yes, if they accept the agreement, then they have to put up a certain uh, amount of money as collateral, right? I'll zoom in a little bit. Um, okay, hopefully y'all can see that now. So they respond to the agreement, they put up some type of deposit, and now the agreement is approved. Now, during the agreement, let's say, one of the landlord feels that, okay, I want to open a dispute. You owe me some money, so they open a dispute. Um, so in this case, the landlord becomes the plaintiff, and the tenant becomes the defendant. And right now, they're requesting 100 in terms of compensation. That's in way. So they're requesting 100 way in compensation. And so the tenant can either counter the dispute, so they could say, "Hey, I actually think I only owe you 55 way instead of 100," and then the landlord in this situation, the plaintiff, can either accept, the counter dispute or decline it. They can just straight up accept the dispute. So they accept the dispute, which means that they settle it, and then a money transfer happens. So the 100 way is transferred from the tenant to the landlord, and then the dispute is closed. Or they can decline the dispute. So they decline the dispute. They might include some of their own evidence, and now the dispute is open to a vote, and then people can vote yes or no. And if a majority vote yes, then a transfer and the voting deadline passes, then funds are transferred from the tenant to a landlord. If people voted no, then no transfer happens, and in both cases the dispute is closed. Again, we're talking about like an appeals process and maybe some other additions. And then, as I said before, voters have to stake some tokens, some of our Harmonia tokens, in order to participate in this process. But yeah, that's kind of just a quick summary. Thank you to everyone at the hackathon for helping and giving us your time for all our questions. It's been a cool experience. Unfortunately, we weren't able to fully finish kind of what we imagined originally. Um, But yeah, it was a cool experience. I learned a lot, and looking forward to learning more. Thanks, guys.